Please listen carefully.
Hi, I'm Paul Frields.
And I'm Dave Guzman.
And welcome to Practical Bass, where each week we pick a topic of interest to you, the working bass player, and we sort of deconstruct it, take it apart, and look at it from a few different angles, and contribute a little bit of our experience and a little bit of our opinion. You can find us on the web at practicalbass.com. We would love for you to leave us some feedback there. There's a contact form that will reach us by email. Dave and I read everything that we get there, so please feel free to get in touch with us. You can also get in touch with us via social media, of course. You can look up the Facebook page for Practical Bass. We are also on Twitter. We are on Google+, and we're even on Instagram, and we'd love to have you guys share pictures of your gear, your rig, or your gigs with us. Our entire reason for being is to help you improve and elevate your gigs and gear to the next level. And in furtherance of that, we would love to connect with you. We'd love to have a conversation with you, what you like, what you dislike. We'd love to hear suggestions for future shows. Please share them with us at any time. And you can hear this podcast every week. We have a fresh episode that comes out on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern weekly, except when we don't quite meet that deadline, right?
Unless if it's not.
It does, unless it doesn't.
It exists or it doesn't.
But regardless, whenever it does emerge from the caverns of the Practical Bass Studios, you guys will be the first to know about it if you subscribe to the podcast. And that if you're going to do one thing, that's the thing we would ask you to do, is subscribe to the podcast. And you can do that very easily. You can go to practicalbass.com and use the subscribe link there to learn how to do that. You can use your iPhone's podcasts app.
Right.
Or if you have a venerable iPod, I suppose you could do that as well.
Right.
If you have a Mac computer, you can use iTunes. You can use Google Play on your Android phone or any computer. You could use Stitcher Radio on any platform. Simply search for Practical Bass and you'll find our friendly black and white PB logo and hit the subscribe link, and you'll get a fresh episode delivered to you every week when it emerges from the studios. So we do ask you to subscribe, and please do feel free to share this with your friends and your relatives, your loved ones, maybe even people you don't like very much, because, hey, every day's another day to turn it around. Right, Dave?
That's right. That's how I look at every day.
That's my philosophy. That's exactly it. So what are we going to talk about today?
Today we have a topic that was a recommendation from a friend of Practical Bass, Adam Smolansky.
Adam is the man.
Yeah.
He is an amazing, first he's an amazing bass player.
Right.
Really great, but also super, super guy.
Yeah, just like a really nice guy, really well thought. Yeah. So for those of our fan base out in San Diego, you can catch Adam Smolansky. He's out there gigging pretty regularly.
Yeah.
So and he happens to be a monster on bass.
Yeah, and super monster. If you watch his right hand, he has that beautiful, effortless drift over the strings, and it's beautiful to watch. Like, I want to cry when I watch it.
Yeah, he has no pinky float. You know, the pinky float. He's like the anti-pinky float.
Yeah, nothing's out of place.
It's all tucked in and efficient and. No, just great. So he recommended a topic for us. He's pinged us a couple of times, and finally we decided to tackle it, and it's the topic of James Jamerson.
And that is a lofty topic to cover for any podcast. And I don't know about you, but I was kind of worried about this one. I'm like, what is our spin on this as Practical Bass?
Right.
Because you could talk about his technique.
Sure.
And you could talk about his, the way he played, but how do we bring that into like a practical sphere, right?
Yeah. And I think for us, just recognizing in general that Jamerson is certainly, one of those bass players who's influenced so many players out there, maybe more than any others in history. Like he just has that style and that name behind him.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about him is, we were discussing this off mic before the episode started, even, that, there may be somebody out there who says, well, yeah, I don't really into that music. Like, I don't dig that music. Like, I'm into this other guy, you know, who's maybe a titan of some genre that you care about. And chances are, if that's a popular genre of any kind, like any kind of, you know, rock, blues, jazz, whatever.
Sure.
You know, he influenced so many leaders that if you're looking up to somebody, even if you're not into Jamerson, chances are your idol is into Jamerson.
Right. Or your idol's idol.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or your idol's idol.
Right.
Even.
That gets a great idol.
Right. And yeah, I was going to make a joke about great and it's just not working. So
well, it's okay.
Skip it.
There was something there.
No, there wasn't.
It's funny.
There was nothing.
It's funny anyways.
Oh my God. So where did you first hear, you know, like obviously Motown, you know, Tamla Motown was like, that was Jamerson's.
Right.
That's where his legend was built.
Yep.
Where and when did you first hear that?
I first heard Motown certainly, well, I guess I'd have to take a guess at it, but I think it was in the womb.
Really early.
Yeah, like super early.
Your ears were just forming.
Maybe even like while I was being created for the very first moment. Yeah. No, I mean, my folks, you know, from an age standpoint, my parents grew up in the 50s and 60s and they grew up in New York, which is not quite Detroit, but
yeah.
I think by the mid 60s, you know, Motown already had a recording studio in New York.
Things were moving.
Yeah. And I think in general, New York really had, you know, in the neighborhoods, they were bringing in, you know, a lot of music that was dance oriented.
Yeah. And that was on the edge. Like Motown was like the edge of what was hip. And it was like, that was the new thing.
Exactly.
It was right before everybody started falling all over themselves to.
Right. So growing up, you know, of course, you know, what was on the record player was typically, you know, it was very common to find, you know, whatever, Stevie Wonder, Temptations, Gladys Knight, Marvin Gaye, all that stuff. You know, I think at a young age, of course, like most, like I didn't even recognize that there was a bass player, that the bass player even existed.
Yeah.
Right. But I would say one thing that I always tie to it is that I have a very like specific memory of being taught how to dance by my aunt at age like 5 or 6. And I remember being in the living room and I remember that it was to I Was Made to Love Her.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Oh, my
so there's
gosh.
something about that. That's like for me, that was looking back, that was a key point.
Yeah.
But, you know, that was my experience. What was your experience in your first sort of Motown?
So I grew up listening to soul music. I think a lot like you. I don't remember if it was in the womb. I honestly don't know. I would be very surprised, but I remember listening to soul music a lot when I was a kid.
Uh-huh.
But the funny thing is, a lot of what I listened to was on Atlantic. Like I didn't hear a lot of Motown when I was super young that I remember, but I do remember Atlantic soul.
Right.
So for me, I was listening to like Wilson Pickett, Otis Redding.
Yeah.
You know, so I was listening to like
it's edgier.
Whereas you had the Motown guys, like I was listening to Muscle Shoals.
Right.
Coming up.
Yeah.
And then, you know, but then later, right, when I was probably, I don't know, 10 or 12, I guess.
Yeah.
That's when Thriller came out.
Right.
And that kind of got me into the history of the Jackson 5 and Motown. That kind of spread out into Motown. Who were all these people who were playing with them back then, and what are these other bands, and all these other things started to like crash in about that point, right? So the Motown 25 special came on, like, you know, was that the year after Thriller or something like that?
Pretty close to, yeah.
Yeah, that was like, it was when there was that time where Michael Jackson was like at the height, you know, of everything, right? And you know, the moonwalk and all that. Anyway, that's what kind of led me into going back and listening to, you know, more Motown. And it was a good time to do it, right? Because The Big Chill came out in 1983.
That's right.
And that kind of resurged all the soul music that, I don't know, like my parents would then kind of like try to lay claim to or something like
Right.
that. They didn't really, like my parents didn't, they didn't really care about this stuff, but I think a lot of suburban parents, like it kind of took them back to their like late teens or whatever.
Sure. Well, just like when we hear music from that era and, however many years ago that was, we cling on to it.
Yeah.
Because it was prevalent, and then you have, it has some relevance and it, brings about memories and whatnot. So you tie to it closer.
Personally, I'd kind of rather tie to that than Bon Jovi. That's just me.
Right.
I can't help it. That's just my bent. Nothing against them.
Hey,
Godspeed. Just, what I like. Anyway, so, so that's a little bit about, Motown as it filtered down to us
right.
as kids. Like we were obviously, we were born after that era. So that's how the music reached us finally.
Right.
Through the years. When did you start to pay attention to James Jamerson as one of the great players in Motown? And, just to be fair, like not the only player, right? Like Bob Babbitt is.
That's right.
One. So, but the thing about Jamerson is, he really had the lock on, I think the parts that people think, oh my gosh, like this is like the epitome of bass playing. So, I mean, how did you discover that? Like, how did you get in tune with what he was doing and really think about that?
I think even at that point, so for me, when I first started playing, I guess there was a string of different influences that were coming in. So we're talking about like the mid 90s. And I remember that there was like, I was just trying to cover a lot of songs, right? And they span like all the way from like Primus, which is like crazy. When you start, you don't know what you're doing. You're just like tackling the monsters, right?
Yeah.
And, of course I was like hitting Jocko, like, oh yeah, I totally don't know what I'm doing. But there was also a patch that like this love for me grew, and it's where I started learning how to play a lot of Stevie Wonder songs, right? It was sort of that feel. And one of the first ones I can remember trying to tackle was Uptight, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Which is almost like gospel in a way, like the way that it drives.
Right. And it's very like, that's a very like four on the floor. Do, 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 do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for me, that was that moment where I still didn't know that was James Jamerson, right? Because I'm not paying attention to that. So I'm still like in this oblivious, just discovering there's a bass player in every band.
Yeah.
But that was probably that point where I realized like groove and feel was critical. Like that's what I was going to take out of bass.
Right.
I wanted that. It probably wasn't until about 10 years after that, give or take, that I just kept hearing this pattern of so many other bassists that I was listening to, like in any sort of like, I guess, interviews or biographies, and they always went back to James Jamerson being one of their biggest influences as a bass player. And I just kept hearing the name that made me think about, researching that and going back to that. And, that was about the time, I guess like 10 years after I started playing, that I really started getting into like transposing, when, like specifically like as hard as I could, like transposing note for note what was going on.
Yeah.
And I get into James Jamerson and I realize it's so simple and it's so complex.
Yeah.
It was like just mind blowing. And that for me was probably the biggest point where I thought, yeah, that's something. He was onto something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and Jamerson, I mean, he was playing bass before the dawn of the electric bass, or, during the time of the dawn of electric bass. So he played upright,
right.
At least this is my memory. Like I read his biography a long time ago, but my memory is that he was an upright player, and, and he brought that to his playing, with his, what they called the hook, right? It was just like his one finger.
Yeah. Which makes sense, right.
But yet is crazy because you hear these bouncy, these bouncy arpeggiated parts that he played.
Right.
And he was playing those with one finger. He was just very,
right.
For him, that was not a workout because he was used to playing an upright. And so the electric is like, oh, this makes it easy.
Yeah.
Now I can really get in and get crazy,
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I took up bass when I was in college, and it was right around the time, I think I picked up bass the year before Alan Slutsky's book, Standing in the Shadows of Motown, came out. And that was a book that, it explored James Jamerson as a player and, and the Motown era and how it affected and how it influenced all of bass that was coming, that came after.
Right.
And a big part of it was it came with this, like a tape or a CD where you could hear all these players, like these other famous players that he had gone out and found, who sat down in the studio and recorded like themselves playing Jamerson's parts.
Oh, wow.
In the music. So you would hear the music on one side, then you'd hear on the other channel, this other famous bass player playing, Jamerson lines. And it was interesting. It had mixed results, I would say.
Right.
I would say the results were mixed. Some of the people brought their own character to the playing, and sometimes that character didn't really mesh well with the groove of the Motown song. But
like they missed the memo.
Yeah. But it was interesting. I mean, it definitely was interesting.
Sure.
And it was, that was the thing that kind of exposed me to him, as the force that he was in bass. And, all the players that I knew from, rock, they all worshipped at the altar of Jamerson. They were like, who's the, Slutsky asked them like who were their greatest influences. And 201, all these guys are like James Jamerson. Like he's the godfather of bass in popular music. So that, that kind of started me to dive deeper into Motown, even at that point, and really, really dig into his parts. And, what got me was that emotional sound that he could portray. He had, these beautiful, very simple lines that he would do for some ballads.
Right.
And it could sound very, very, almost a little mournful. And then, he had parts that were, for up-tempo numbers that are just these joyous, bouncy, almost little symphonies. Like they're literally little symphonies unto themselves.
Right.
And that just amazed me. Like if you sit down and really listen to some of his parts that he does, like, I was made to love her or something like that. Like you hear what he's doing and you're just like, this guy was so far beyond anything that anyone was doing with, bass in any kind of popular music. I mean, but especially in pop in those days.
Right.
He wasn't just holding down a root or something. It was
He not only did he get away with it, but he turned it into something.
Yeah. It was like a thing unto itself.
And for those that are involved in like writing original bass lines, like I think the tendency is just to find a line that works and you use that for the song.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You might like tweak it.
Yeah.
It's like there was an interview with, the big like Jaco Pastorius kind of like video that, the instructional video where he's interviewed for a bit. And he would always just, at one point he says, it's just like, I see a lot of cats just like wiggling around their fingers, right? Like just making something out of nothing.
Yeah.
And that's, it's a tendency. It's a tendency for bass players to have just a line and then they'll, either like wiggle their fingers or just do something more out of whatever the line is delivering. But to have an intentional, like you said, that as though it's like a symphony.
Yeah, he would he'd have this part and then it would develop over the course of the song to where, I mean, it would be, obviously you could still kind of feel the fundamental theme of what that line was, but he'd play around with it. He'd add embellishments. There'd be like, different chord tones that he would use around the notes from, the first verse would kind of like establish it. The second verse would kind of grow it a little bit. The bridge, like his bridge parts were insane. And then he'd come back to the third part and just take it to a whole new level when it came back. Right. And sometimes there'd be a modulation there. So he's in a new key, but he's still playing with this original pattern, but then, taking it even further to give it like lift the third verse, right? Or the last verse, like lift it beyond where the rest of the song was. Like he was thinking in terms of arrangements. Well, I don't know.
That's right.
I don't know whether he was thinking of that or whether he just did it instinctively, but it doesn't matter either way. It was genius.
Right. I always felt like one of the coolest things about his bass lines are that, this is a period where like it was the lead vocalist was the star, right? Whoever was singing, it was typically like the name of the band, or, if it's a group of people, that's who the name of the band was them, right?
So in the Hoogie Budgies.
Exactly. And to me, what I got from it, and maybe this is super obvious, I just don't care, but it's that he played around the melody of the voice. And if you, I Was Made to Love Her has like that harmonica part.
Yeah.
Right. And then he's playing around the harmonica.
Right.
And it kind of like plays in that era. Right. Or if it's like Gladys, like he's playing around.
Yeah.
For me, maybe that's just my interpretation of it, but I always felt like the way that he was composing was, he was being centric to what the vocals are doing. Like
when that harmonica solo starts, right? And people can go listen to the recording and, hear a little bit of it. Just, go to YouTube and look it up. But, the harmonica solo starts, and the harmonica over the course of the solo moves up, right? It keeps kind of moving up by stair steps, a little bit at a time. And then you notice like, oh, now it's a little higher. Now it's a little higher until it gets to the, that amazing, high note, da, 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 da. And while he's doing that, like, especially when he starts out, right, Stevie's playing the harmonica part and it's moving up, Jamerson drops below. Like he goes from the root and then drops to the third that's below that, right? Like he's kind of like giving the motion under it, but he's doing it by anchoring it deeper in the ground.
Right.
And like giving him the foundation to work with.
Exactly.
And he's not just playing, he's not just playing like a simple root. He's like, he's working, like he's hearing the drums and he's hearing the rhythm of the solo and working around with that.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the thing it's brilliant. And, if this all sounds very, I don't know, highfalutin or technical, I would challenge the listeners, go get a recording of this and just like put it on loop and really just like listen to it, and not just the bass, but listen to the harmonica part, listen to the vocal, and then compare them back to the bass.
Right.
And check out what you're hearing there. Like listen to what's happening, like how each of those things is moving. I would say, it's one of those amazing moments when you hear a bass player who is able to work within the structure of a song like that, but yet, create something that is, it's almost so good, it stands up by itself.
Right.
Yep. That is truly, it's truly miraculous. It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. So, the challenge then though, right, I guess just to bring this back, we're both kind of like definitely waxing the Jamerson car at this point, and it's a shame that, he passed away without receiving the accolades that he so dearly deserved. And, another recommendation for listeners, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely go. Don't go, get it on BitTorrent or whatever. Don't go, get it from the library. Literally just go buy the movie, the documentary Standing in the Shadows of Motown. Just buy it.
Yeah.
And that is a documentary that is about the Funk Brothers, right?
Yep.
The all of the amazing musicians who created the Motown sound. It wasn't just Jamerson. He was surrounded by great players. And, when you're a bass player, you're going to sound as good as, The rest of the rhythm section does.
Yep.
And these guys were amazing. They're amazing together. And 40 years later, they're still amazing.
Yep.
When they did these shows with some artists who were contemporary at the time.
Yep.
Who understood and really got inside that music as well. So just get that documentary, Standing in the Shadows of Motown. You can get it on DVD. Just buy it. It is absolutely fantastic. And you'll probably watch it over and over. I mean, I don't think a year goes by that I don't pull it out and watch it again, just because it's so inspiring to watch these guys, how they groove together, how they lock together, and it's just effortless.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is Jamerson had passed away before that was made, but there's a big part of that movie that's about his contributions to the group. And they all knew he was a genius, right? These guys are all great players, but they knew that he was like a true genius. And, he was kind of a crazy man too. A lot of geniuses, he was, he was touched by genius and touched by a little bit of that insanity too. But I mean, not
buy one, get one free.
Yeah. Yeah. Not to the level of he was like some homicidal maniac or something. He was just a funny guy. Like he played practical jokes on them and things like that. It was just, he was a funny guy, but, and then he had, kind of, sadly, he drifted like a lot of musicians did into substance abuse, particularly alcohol. I don't know much about a lot of his later years. I don't know if anyone really does, because he sort of drifted out of the public eye a bit. And when the Motown 25 special came around, he was around for that, but didn't really get not much of that really impacted his life.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that he was instrumental in creating what was the Motown sound. Right. And, he passed away, some few years after that. I wanted late 80s, I think, mid late 80s. And, and so he didn't see this resurgence of interest, and the documentarians who were interested in the history of popular music and what a big part he played in that. That's a shame. And I think the best way to honor that legacy is really go check out the guy's work, because whatever else you might think of him, like his work just stands for itself. I mean, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Hey guys, this is Paul.
This is Dave.
And so this conversation on James Jamerson really went on for a while. I mean, there's so much to say about the guy. He is one of the greatest luminary figures in all of bass playing. And, we did spend a while talking about him. Dave and I kind of looked at each other after this got done, and we thought, this really is going to take 2 episodes rather than kind of sock you with an hour of stuff at once.
Yeah, why don't we just go ahead, just split it up, turn it into 2 episodes, let you digest it a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And, what better way to, say thanks to our pal Adam than having him be responsible for 2 episodes rather than 1.
Yeah, so if you don't like it, then you could blame Adam.
Yeah, just blame Adam. It's all his fault.
He's in San Diego. I don't know if we mentioned that or not.
He's very far away from us, so we don't, it's going to take a while for him to get here and punish us for that. So
it's like a time delay.
Yeah, so... Yeah. So anyway, we'll definitely have part 2 out next week, and we hope you'll come back and join us for the second part of this chat, because hopefully our love for Jamerson comes through, and for those of you who maybe don't love him, maybe this will give you some new ways to kind of chew on his legacy and think about how that might affect your work as a player.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll see you next week.